Once upon a time, long before humans roamed the earth, there were the fairy folk. They were a magical race of beings that lived in the west of Ireland, where the land was lush and green and the sea was crystal blue. The fairy folk were known for their beauty, their grace, and their magical powers. One day, the fairy queen decided that it was time for her people to spread their wings and explore the world beyond their homeland. She called upon her most trusted advisors, and together they came up with a plan to send a group of fairies on a journey across the sea to the British Isles. The fairies were excited for the adventure and eagerly set across the water. It was a treacherous journey, but the fairy folk were determined to make it to their destination. As they sailed, they sang songs of magic and wonder, filling the air with their sweet melodies. When they arrived in the British Isles, the fairy folk were amazed by the beauty of the land. The rolling hills, the towering mountains, and the sparkling seas were unlike anything they had ever seen before. They explored the forests, the rivers, and the fields, delighting in the new sights and sounds around them. As they journeyed further into the British Isles, the fairy folk encountered other magical creatures. They met with the sprites and pixies who welcomed them warmly and showed them around their homes in the woods. The fairies were enchanted by the playful nature of the sprites and the mischievous antics of the pixies. The fairies also met with other creatures not so friendly, such as the trolls and the goblins. These creatures were known to cause trouble and chaos wherever they went. The fairy folk, being peaceful and kind-hearted, were cautious around them, but did not let their presence dampen their spirits. Eventually, the fairy folk found a beautiful glade in the heart of the British Isles. It was a place of great beauty, with a shimmering pond at its centre, surrounded by trees that were centuries old. The fairies knew that this was the perfect place for them to settle down and make their new home. They began to build their homes in the trees, using magic to create the most beautiful dwellings. They decorated them with flowers, ivy, and crystals, making them shine in the sunlight. They even created a beautiful garden in the center of the glade, where they grew all kinds of plants, including rare and magical flowers. As the years went by, the fairy folk prospered in their new home. They had many children who were born with the same magical abilities as their parents. The children played in the gardens, learning magic from their elders, and exploring the woods and fields of the British Isles. But as the fairies grew in numbers, they also grew in power. They became feared by some humans who saw them as a threat. The humans began to fear the fairies' magical abilities, which they believed were beyond their control. One day, a group of humans decided to take action against the fairy folk. They gathered weapons and set out to attack the glade where the fairies lived. The fairies were taken by surprise, but they were not defenseless. They used their magic to fight back, casting spells that caused the humans to become disoriented and lose their weapons. The fairy queen knew that the humans would not stop their attack, so she decided to take action. She gathered her most trusted advisors and came up with a plan to protect her people. They decided to create a magical shield around the glade, one that would keep the humans out and protect the fairies from harm. The shield was powerful and it worked. The humans were unable to penetrate it, and they eventually gave up and left the fairies alone. The fairies continued to live in peace in their glade, protected by their magic and their love for one another. As the years went by, the fairy folk continued to thrive in the British Isles. They became known as a powerful magical race, respected by all those who knew them. They continued to explore the land, learning new things and making new friends. And so the fairy folk remained in the British Isles, living in harmony with the creatures of the land, protected by their magic and living a life of wonder. They remained a legend, one that was whispered about in the shadows and believed by those who had seen their magic firsthand. As times passed, humans began to appear in greater numbers in the British Isles. At first, the fairy folk were curious about these new arrivals and watched them from afar, fascinated by their actions and their way of life. Some of the fairy folk even ventured out to meet the humans, hoping to establish a peaceful relationship. As the humans began to settle and build their communities, the fairy folk were there to assist them. Some of the fairies passed on ancient knowledge, teaching the humans about the magic of the land and how to harness its power. Others helped the humans discover hidden treasures, guiding them to places where they could find gold and precious gems. In return, the humans showed the fairy folk kindness and respect. They recognized the magical abilities of the fairies and acknowledged their importance in the land. They even began to create legends and myths about the fairy folk, spreading their stories far and wide. However, as the human population grew, their needs and desires began to change. They started to cut down trees and clear the land for farming and building, destroying the natural habitats of the fairy folk. Some humans also began to fear the fairy folk's magical powers, believing that they were dangerous and should be avoided. The fairy folk tried to reason with the humans, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. They watched helplessly as their homes were destroyed and their natural resources were depleted. Many fairy folk began to fear their survival, and some even contemplated leaving the British Isles altogether. Despite these challenges, some humans continued to work alongside the fairy folk, recognizing their importance in the land. They formed alliances and friendships, working together to protect magical creatures and the land they inhabited. Over time, the relationship between humans and the fairy folk became more complex. While some humans continued to honor and respect the fairies, others saw them as a nuisance or even a threat. Some humans tried to capture the fairy folk, hoping to use their magical powers for their own purposes, while others tried to drive them away from their homes. The Fairy Queen knew that something had to be done to protect her people and the land they called home. She summoned the most powerful fairies in the land, and together they cast a powerful spell that would protect the fairy folk and the land they inhabited. The spell created a barrier around the fairy glade, making it impossible for humans to enter without permission. The spell worked, and the fairy folk were able to continue living in peace and harmony. They continued to explore the land, discovering new secrets and sharing their magic with those humans who were willing to listen. While the relationship between humans and the fairy folk was complex, it was ultimately one of respect and admiration. And so, the fairy folk continued to live in the British Isles, protected by their magic and their love for the land. They remained a legend, one that was whispered about in the shadows and believed by those who had seen their magic firsthand. They knew that their relationship with humans was fragile, but they also knew that they